I hate my childhood and everything that remains from it. This is the bitter statement of the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre in the autobiography entitled The Words, which he wrote when he was in his late 50s and which describes his life up to the age of 12. Sartre's autobiography is a biting, aggressive attack upon his father and mother, his grandparents, and the bourgeois society into which he was born. Sartre attacks all of these from his viewpoint as an existentialist and also from his more recent Marxist position. It is doubtful whether any other intellectual or artist has ever written such a hostile description of his own childhood. What was this childhood like? The childhood of the most influential existentialist philosopher of the 20th century. Sartre was born in Paris in 1905. His father was a second lieutenant in the French Navy who had contracted an intestinal disease while on duty in French Indochina and died when Jean-Paul was only 15 months old. Sartre's mother, Anne-Marie, had no option but to return with her infant son to the home of her parents, Charles and Louise Schweitzer. The Schweitzer family had their roots in Alsace, which had become part of Germany. Anne-Marie's first cousin and her father's nephew was the famous Protestant theologian and medical missionary to Africa, Albert Schweitzer. The household in which Jean-Paul grew up was dominated by his grandfather, Charles Schweitzer, a language teacher, the author of a German language textbook used in all French schools, and the inventor of a new direct method of teaching languages. Although Charles Schweitzer had been ready for retirement, he went back to teaching in order to support Anne-Marie and her son. And in return, Anne-Marie became, in effect, an unpaid housekeeper for her parents, and was treated as a child again, totally subordinate to their instructions and wishes. Sartre makes the point that as a young child he was already perceiving in his grandparents' treatment of his mother the exploitation practiced by the bourgeoisie and the hypocrisy with which they concealed this exploitation and selfishness with high-sounding liberal principles. Sartre's autobiography is especially savage in exposing the bourgeois hypocritical pretentiousness of Charles Schweitzer. Charles Schweitzer was a tall, handsome, bearded man whom Sartre describes as looking so much like God the Father that he was often taken for him. But although he ruled the household by playing the role of a stern, godlike patriarch, Charles Schweitzer soon became completely devoted to his grandson and kept him at home until he was 10 years old, supplying him with tutors rather than submit him to the inferior standards and the less gifted students of the public schools. Here again Sartre discovers bourgeois hypocrisy, concealed behind the grandfather's high-sounding, noble intentions of treating the small boy as a child prodigy who deserved superior private education. There was a profoundly selfish motive. The presence of the small boy in the household served to alleviate Charles Schweitzer's fear of his own death. And so it was for a selfish reason, hypocritically concealed by bourgeois ideals of superior education, that the young Jean-Paul Sartre was kept at home for 5 years beyond the normal time for entering school. He received a poor education from irregular tutoring, he was cut off from association with children of his own age, and he was kept a prisoner, sequestered in the apartment on the top floor of number 1 Rue Le Goff in the Latin Quarter of Paris. Even his physical well-being was neglected by his grandparents. Sartre tells us they failed to notice and to get medical help for a growth in his right eye, which was to give him a wall-eyed, cross-eyed look for which he is famous, and eventually brought about the loss of sight in that eye. This was another example of the bourgeois hypocrisy with its lofty claims to humane concern for others, actually concealing indifference and selfishness. There was, however, one advantage in being kept sequestered on the top floor of the apartment building at number 1 Rue Le Goff, and that was the small boy lived in a world of books, the books which overflowed his grandfather's study, the lending library books of his grandmother, the books from which Anne-Marie read him stories. I began my life, Sartre says, as I shall no doubt end it, amidst books. The words in these books became the world which the boy longed to possess and manipulate, and by the age of 3 he was wild with joy, as he says. He had taught himself how to read. And responding to the flatteries of his grandfather, the small boy became a little monster, cleverly playing the role of a child prodigy, and he took the next step. he began to write his own books. But it was Charles Schweitzer who pronounced the words which decided Sartre's fate, his lifelong vocation, his original project, which became the project to which he has given his entire life, the project of writing, of becoming a writer. Sartre, in his autobiography, recalls this occasion when his grandfather became deadly serious, and talking man to the 7-year-old boy who was sitting on his lap, the grandfather said that it was understood, of course, that the boy would be a writer, but that he should be warned that literature did not fill a man's belly. This was the moment, hearing these words, when Sartre made his own original choice of what he would become. And as we will see, Sartre's existentialism claims that a similar event occurs in the development of all persons, a moment when the person chooses the original project which will color the rest of his life. But Charles Schweitzer was given no credit even for this, for his role in Sartre's choice of his vocation, his life's project as a writer. Instead, Sartre condemns the view of literature which he acquired from his grandfather, the view that literature can provide man's salvation. At the end of his autobiography, Sartre says, he has finally smashed that illusion to bits. Literature, he now sees, doesn't save anything or anyone. Literature, he says, is only a mirror which gives us a picture of ourselves. He sees now that his writing career was a fake, the bourgeois artist's pretension that he is God, a savior of mankind. But by now, this faking, this imposture, has eaten its way into his character, and he knows that he can never be cured of it. I still write, he says. What can I do? Sartre's education, once he was liberated from his grandfather's apartments, was provided by some of the finest schools in France, culminating in the École Normale Supérieure, a graduate school for the training of university professors, the most intellectual and exclusive of all French graduate schools. After Sartre's graduation, there came the competitive examinations for college teachers of philosophy, which Sartre failed the first time. The second time, however, Sartre took first place, and the second place was taken by Simone de Beauvoir. They had met shortly before their exams in the spring of 1929, and they had been lovers and friends and also partners in philosophy and politics ever since, for 50 years, while always defiantly rejecting bourgeois marriage for themselves. Simone de Beauvoir is an important contributor in her own right to French existentialism. Short stories and novels, a study of women called The Second Sex, and many philosophical essays. Most of what we know about Sartre comes from her own autobiography, which is now in 4 volumes. They both began teaching philosophy in colleges, Sartre in the northern port city of Le Havre, de Beauvoir in the Mediterranean port of Marseille. In 1933-34, Sartre was able to be released from teaching, which he regarded as imprisonment, both for himself and for his students, by gaining a scholarship for himself to the French Institute in Berlin, where Hitler had just a few months before become Chancellor of Germany. Neither Sartre nor de Beauvoir at this time had any knowledge of politics, nor any interest in it. Both of them were passionately opposed to the entire bourgeois world and were dedicated to destroying it. But this they intended to achieve by literature, not by politics. It was during this year of the establishment of Nazi totalitarianism in Germany that Sartre lived as a politically naive and unaware student in Berlin and established for himself his philosophical ties to the currents of philosophy which were then developing in the heavy and dangerous atmosphere of Germany prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. This contemporary German philosophy joined with older great philosophical traditions to be the resources with which the bold and subtle imagination of Jean-Paul Sartre worked. Sartre is attempting to create a philosophy for modern man to live by, a philosophy which will provide guidance for one's life by explaining the nature of the world and by expressing the human condition, what it is like to live as a human being. To which philosophers of the past will he turn for support, and from which will he turn away? He turns away from all empiricism, because empiricism limits knowledge to sense perception, and empiricism denies that philosophy can provide guidance for human life. Sartre also turns away from rationalistic deduction, such as Descartes, because deduction can neither explain the world nor express what it is like to live as a human being. Who then are the philosophers to whom Sartre turns? Who are the philosophers who are Sartre's powerful resources in the history of philosophy, and from whom the richness of Sartre's philosophy is derived? First of all, Sartre's philosophy derives from Descartes, who, as the first and greatest of all French philosophers, remains a formidable influence upon all French philosophers who have followed him. The influence of Descartes upon Sartre is clear. It is Descartes' subjectivism. It is Descartes' insistence that philosophy begins with the absolute certainty of my consciousness of myself. A second resource upon which Sartre was to draw was the analysis of consciousness that was available in the exciting new philosophy of Edmund Husserl, which Sartre studied intensively during his year at the French Institute in Berlin. Edmund Husserl, a professor of philosophy at Freiburg and other German universities, had originally been a mathematician and a physicist. Like Descartes, who had also been a mathematician and physicist, Husserl tried to achieve for philosophy the certainty of mathematics. Husserl himself pointed out his similarity to Descartes, that they both attempted to find certainty for philosophy, and both found it in the cogito, in the self which thinks and cannot be doubted. What Sartre takes from Husserl's complex and formal philosophy is the discovery, first, that I am not a thing, a thinking substance, as Descartes claimed. I am not substantial, a stable, enduring self. And secondly, from Husserl, he takes the concept that from Husserl, that consciousness is always of something other than itself, that consciousness is directed toward an object, that consciousness is intentional. A third philosophy upon which Sartre soon draws is that of the German existentialist Martin Heidegger, Husserl's most brilliant student and the successor to Husserl's professorship at the University of Freiburg. From Heidegger, Sartre takes the concept of existence as being in the world and the concept of being thrown absurdly into existence. Also from Heidegger, Sartre takes the concept of man as making himself by having projects into the future, and finally, the distinction between authentic and inauthentic existence. In addition to using Descartes and Husserl for their analysis of consciousness, and Heidegger for his existentialism, in addition to these philosophies, Sartre also finds valuable philosophical materials in the dialectical philosophies of Hegel and Marx, and their analysis of self and society, and also in the two major forerunners of existentialism, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. From Hegel, Sartre takes the distinction between the object as it is in itself and the object as it is for a subject. Also, Sartre takes the concept of dialectic from Hegel and uses it in the basic opposition between my conscious being and its nothingness, and in the great opposition between being and nothingness. From Marx, Sartre will attempt in 1960 to take his entire system, with some revisions, and to incorporate existentialism within Marxism. From Kierkegaard, Sartre takes the emphasis upon existence instead of upon essence, and also Kierkegaard's concept of dread. And finally, from Nietzsche, he takes the concept of the bold freedom of the Superman in being a law unto himself, independent of conventional thought or morality. The first significant product of Sartre's philosophical reflections was a novel, the philosophical novel to which his publisher gave the title Nausea. Why a novel? Sartre is already finding his way at this point toward a philosophy of existentialism which will use literature, novels, plays, short stories, to grasp concrete human existence, to present my existence, the human condition, the lived life, as distinct from the overlay of essences by which other philosophers, the sciences, social organizations, conceal, distort, and explain away my concrete existence as a conscious being. As Simone de Beauvoir says, a philosopher who makes subjectivity, concrete human existence, central to his viewpoint is bound to become a literary artist, so as to convey the human condition in its full concrete reality. And she adds that only the novel allows a writer to evoke the original gushing forth of existence. Sartre had been working on the novel Nausea for almost a decade, ever since his years in graduate school. When Nausea was published in France in 1938, it was an immediate and huge success, and rapidly in the following years, the principal character of the novel Nausea, Antoine Roquentin, has become a familiar figure in Western civilization. He has become a recognized stable part of our literary world, as have other literary figures like Shakespeare's Hamlet, or Dickens's Oliver Twist, or James Joyce's Bloom, or Kafka's heroes whose names begin with the letter K. References to Roquentin's concrete existence, to Roquentin's experience, his nausea, his crisis of despair, occur throughout contemporary discussions in the fields of psychology and philosophy, and wherever the consciousness of modern man is examined. Who is Roquentin, and how has Sartre's finest philosophical novel made him into a personality so real for us that he lives among us outside the novel itself? What are the moods and thoughts of this fictional character, and how have they become our own moods and thoughts? The novel is shrewdly presented by Sartre as Roquentin's own diary, a first-person account of his daily life, written only for himself, as a direct and truthful statement of one man's subjectivity, one man's concrete here and now existence. The scene is a port city in France, which has the name of Bouville, which means Mudville. It is clearly a description of the actual port of Le Havre, the main port of France, the ugly commercial city in which Sartre lived in cheap hotels near the railroad station while he was teaching philosophy there. In many ways, Roquentin is similar to Sartre. He is close to 30 years old. He comes from a middle-class background and is living on a small inherited income. He is an intellectual and a writer. But Roquentin is represented as being tall, rather than short, as Sartre is, and with red hair, and as having no family ties, no job, no friends. But he had traveled widely. He is a free man, free to do what he wants, and he has come to Bouville to finish a biography that he is writing on the life of an 18th century diplomat, the Marquis de Rolbon. But from the very first page we know that something is wrong. The first page of the diary mentions that a change has come over him, and we soon learn that the whole point of keeping a diary is to determine what this change is and what it means for his life. The best thing, he says in the diary, would be to write down events from day to day. And above all, he says, I must tell how I see this table, this street, the people, my packet of tobacco, since those are the things which have changed. With these words, Sartre has taken us into the psychology of a mind that is aware that it is slipping away from its normal states, aware that his world is beginning to take on a strange new appearance, and yet he is sufficiently in touch with reality to want to observe his own mental states, to want to keep a day-to-day account of his psychological symptoms. When did it all begin? Roquentin remembers that on Saturday, some children were playing on the waterfront, and like them, he says, I wanted to throw a stone into the sea. But when he picked up a stone, he says, I saw something which disgusted me. He is confronted by the stone's bare existence, and he is overwhelmed by a feeling of nausea. Day after day he lives with depression, nausea, feelings of vertigo, and mounting anxiety. The nausea is becoming constant. It even comes over him in the cafe, which had been a place of refuge, well lighted, full of people. But now, Roquentin says, the nausea is not inside me. I am the one who is inside it. As the days go by, Roquentin discovers that there is no rational order in existence. Things have no essences which define what they are. There are no fixed laws according to which things relate to other things in the universe. All rationality, all sciences are only of our own making. They have nothing to do with the bare existence that they name. Things, says Roquentin, are divorced from their names. And when we face them in their bare existence, they are simply there, loathsome and fearful, and we experience them with nausea. Roquentin is riding on a streetcar in Bouville, and he says, "This thing I'm sitting on, leaning my hand on, is called a seat," he says. "They made it purposely for people to sit on. They took leather, springs, and cloth. They went to work with the idea of making a seat. And when they finished, that was what they had made." Said Roquentin, "I murmur, it's a seat. But the word stays on my lips. It refuses to go and put itself on the thing. It stays what it is, with its red plush, thousands of little red paws in the air, all still, little dead paws." And then he says, "This enormous belly turned upward, bleeding, inflated, bloated, with all its dead paws, this belly floating in this car, in this gray sky, is not a seat. It could as well be a dead donkey, tossed about in the water." In this agonizing, terrifying fantasy about the red plush seat of the streetcar, Roquentin is discovering that things in their actual existence have nothing to do with the names we give them, and that the existence of things has no connection with the essence which we assign to them. This thing on which he is sitting, is it a streetcar seat? Is this its name? Is this its essence? That is one interpretation. It could just as well be 1,000 little red paws, or the red belly of a dead donkey. Things as they exist in their nakedness have no essences. Their existence is not confined by any words or explanations that we give them. Sartre and his hero Roquentin have here reached the same conclusion as David Hume had reached 200 years earlier. The world of existence, of matters of fact, has no connection with the world of words, reason, mathematics, and logic. Existence is not rational. There is no reason that things are as they are and not otherwise. There is no rational explanation as to why there is any world at all, rather than nothing. Why does Sartre respond to the irrationality of existence with a sense of excitement, fear, and nausea? It is because to Sartre, as to Kierkegaard and to Nietzsche before him, philosophies are not intellectual games. Philosophies are things we live by, and are a matter of life and death for the human spirit, because of their powerful effect upon human psychology. And if it is true that existence has no rationality and no order, is governed by no scientific laws and by no philosophic essences, then anything can happen in such a universe. The world without any structure falls apart and dissolves, and I myself dissolve along with it. As Roquentin says, in such a world, my tongue may turn into a centipede. 200 years ago, David Hume had said that since the world is one in which reason and existence have no connection with each other, there is no reason that the sun will rise tomorrow. On the streetcar, Roquentin's nausea moves toward crisis as he feels himself surrounded by nameless, frightening things. He jumps off of the streetcar, runs into the park, and drops onto a park bench. He feels that he is suffocating. Existence penetrates him through his eyes, nose, mouth. And here in front of him are the roots of a chestnut tree protruding from the ground under the bench. And he says, "I was sitting," says Roquentin, "stooping forward, head bowed, alone, in front of this black, knotty mass, entirely beastly, which frightened me. Then I had this vision." Here, then, is Sartre's famous chestnut-tree vision. "Never," Roquentin continues, "until these last few days had I understood the meaning of existence. And then, all of a sudden, there it was, clear as day." Roquentin looks around at the chestnut tree, the park gates, the fountain, and himself, a red-haired man digesting on a bench, and it suddenly flashes upon him that none of these things have the slightest reason to be there. None of these things is necessary. They are all simply in the way and superfluous. Roquentin knows now that he has found, as he says, the key to existence, the key to my nausea, to my own life. The key is absurdity, the fundamental lack of any rationality in the existence of things. This root of the chestnut tree, this existence, escaped all explanation. It was below explanation. It was simply there, for no reason, without explanation, and it was absurd. All existence is merely contingent, without any necessity to exist, without any rationality, simply in the way, superfluous, and so it is absurd. Now Roquentin understood his nausea. Nausea is what human beings cannot help feeling in the face of the absurd, in the face of a world which is irrational, superfluous, and therefore absurd. This is the world-shattering vision of the chestnut tree. It has now taken its place among the great visionary experiences of human history. But there remained for Roquentin another discovery, this time not about things, but about himself. The self which he has assumed he had, namely Roquentin, this person whom he thought of as having the essence of a man, an intellectual, an historian, the biographer of the Marquis de Rolbon. This, too, is only an interpretation, an essence which he has constructed for himself, but which has nothing to do with his existence. The self exists only as a consciousness which is conscious of a succession of objects. There is no enduring self, no Cartesian cogito, no thinking substance. No one lives there anymore, he says. There is only the stream of consciousness of this and that object. And so, in addition to the loss of Descartes' physical substances, there is the loss of the Cartesian self, the thinking substance which Descartes had carefully established. Both are now gone. There are no physical substances, there are no thinking substances. What is now left for Roquentin? Off and on, his nausea had been relieved when an American jazz record was played on the jukebox in the cafe, a record of a black woman singing Some of These Days. Roquentin has already decided to give up writing the biography, and in a final moment of inspiration, he thinks of the New York musician creating this song, Some of These Days, and he thinks that he, too, will create something. He is thinking of writing a novel, so that in artistic creation, finally, he will have a reason for living, and perhaps even a way to redeem his life. Next time, we will see how Sartre handles these problems in his great philosophical work, Being and Nothingness.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.